Okay, picture this. You're standing on the very edge of the known world, staring out into this freezing, gray, turbulent horizon that, according to literally every conventional map of the time, simply shouldn't exist. There's just nothing out there. Welcome to this explainer. Today, we are going to unpack a truly epic narrative that basically vanished into the mist for centuries. We're uncovering the forgotten Viking expansion, looking at the undeniable, hard evidence of the Norse discovery of North America. It is a story packed with extreme danger, just next-level navigation, and a desperate battle for survival. So let's dive right in and reshape the map of history.
And honestly, that brings us to a quote that just perfectly sets the stage for all of this. Everything you were taught about the discovery of America is off by 500 years. Because, for generations, the textbooks focused entirely on 1492. Columbus, the Nina, the Pinta, the Santa Maria crossing the ocean blue. We all know the rhyme. But long before those famous sails ever caught the wind, there were the dragon ships. We are talking about open, wooden boats crashing through massive Atlantic waves, driven by some of the absolute toughest seafarers in human history. 500 years. I mean, just stop and think about how much the entire world changed between the year 1000 AD and 1500 AD. That is the massive timeline shift we're dealing with here. By the time the rest of Europe was just sort of beginning to dream of a new world across the sea, the descendants of the Norse explorers had already been there. They'd built homes, they fought battles, and they'd already left. It completely, fundamentally reframes our whole understanding of global exploration.
Part 1. The brutal Atlantic crossing. Now, before the Norse could even think about settling, they had to actually survive a journey that very few modern sailors would ever willingly attempt in similar vessels. And this wasn't some pleasure cruise, right? This was a desperate expansion driven by political exile, harsh climates, and just a really intense hunger for new, farmable land. And they didn't just sail straight across from Norway in one go. It was more like a stepping stone process. First, they departed from Iceland. Then they established a really rugged settlement in Greenland. But Greenland lacked a totally vital resource: timber. So, right around the year 1000 AD, they pushed even further west across what is famously known as the Graveyard of the Atlantic. They hit the stone-slab shores of a place they called Helluland, then they found the dense forest of Markland, before finally making their fateful arrival in Newfoundland. Can you imagine making that exact journey in an open, freezing wooden longship?
So you're probably wondering, how did they actually survive that crossing without modern compasses? Well, the answer lies in something called sunstones. The North Atlantic is notoriously overcast. It is constantly cloaked in thick fog and just punishing storms. But Leif Erikson and his highly skilled crew utilized these unique polarizing crystals to pinpoint the exact position of the sun, even through heavy, thick cloud cover. It was literally a life-saving piece of medieval navigation technology. It was an absolute game-changer that allowed them to conquer those massive waves and brutal elements without just getting hopelessly lost in the void.
Part 2. Life in the Vinland settlement.
Okay, so once they navigated those treacherous waters, the whole mission shifted from sheer ocean survival to the really gritty, rugged coastal reality of their new home, a place we now know as Lonzo Meadows. And that brings us to the name itself, Vinland, because when the Norsemen arrived, they found something that was incredibly rare and super valuable to them: wild grapes. Now, you have to understand, coming from the freezing, completely barren landscapes of Greenland and Iceland, finding an environment lush enough to actually support wild grapes, that was a massive environmental shift. It was a clear sign of incredible natural wealth, which led directly to them naming the territory Vinland, which translates to wineland.
But listen, finding a few grapes did not mean they'd arrived in some easy paradise. The reality of wineland was mostly just a backbreaking daily grind. Try to picture the cold blues and deep forest greens of the Newfoundland coast as they spent hours harvesting bog iron just to forge basic nails, or cutting massive heavy chunks of earth to build these really claustrophobic sod longhouses, all just to insulate themselves against the freezing North American winters. Shivering inside a dirt hut in the bitter cold? Welcome to wineland, right? This wasn't exactly a vacation retreat. It was survival pure and simple, fueled by sheer willpower.
Part 3. First contact and conflict.
Because the thing is, the Norse were not alone in this new land, and very quickly, this mission of exploration inevitably transformed into a battle for survival. According to the Vinland Sagas, which are the ancient texts that actually recorded these journeys, the Norse soon encountered the existing inhabitants of the land. The Sagas refer to the indigenous peoples they met as the Skraeling. And this right here is the historic first contact between Europeans and the indigenous populations of North America, a monumental, world-colliding event happening half a millennium before Columbus. And it sets the stage for a very complicated and, unfortunately, ultimately tragic relationship. While there are some accounts of an initial tentative trade between the Vikings and the indigenous peoples, the unfortunate reality is that the peace shattered rapidly. You had cultural misunderstandings, intense disputes over trade, and frankly, the inherent tension of a heavily armed foreign presence just encroaching on native land. It all quickly boiled over. The completely isolated Viking settlement was plunged into direct and rising conflict, surrounded by a much larger local population who were rightfully defending their territory. That initial dream of a permanent Vinland was very quickly turning into a nightmare.
Part 4. Why the Vikings vanished.
And this brings us to the great mystery that historians have debated for centuries. Why abandon it all? Well, the answer really lies in the psychology of their departure. See, as modern people, we tend to project our own biases backward. We see this as the grand discovery of a new world, like it was this holy mission of monumental global importance. But to the Vikings, it was completely 100% pragmatic.
Vinland wasn't some sacred destiny. It was really just another island further west. It had great timber, it had grapes, sure. But the moment the costs outweighed the benefits, they had absolutely no psychological barrier preventing them from just tacking up their ships and heading home.
And let's be clear, those costs absolutely did outweigh the benefits. The whole thing was a logistical nightmare that essentially forced the retreat. Because even though Vinland had wood, the colony was still fundamentally dealing with massive resource scarcity, especially when it came to manpower and support. Secondly, the extreme distance from their home base in Greenland meant their supply lines were incredibly fragile and highly dangerous to maintain. And finally, those rising tensions and violent conflicts with the indigenous populations made the settlement practically indefensible for just a small band of Norsemen. At the end of the day, they simply didn't have the numbers to hold the land.
Part 5. Unearthing the Viking Legacy.
For hundreds and hundreds of years, the story of Vinland existed only in the spoken words and the written pages of those old Norse sagas. Most of the world just completely dismissed it as a fun, colorful myth. That is, until 1960, when science finally caught up. A Norwegian explorer named Helgi Engstad and an archaeologist named Anne Steen Engstad discovered the actual remains of a Norse settlement at Lanso Meadows in Newfoundland, Canada. They found the clear, undeniable outlines of those exact sod longhouses we talked about earlier. They found a bronze ring-headed pin. They even found iron slag from a Norse forge. In literally one stroke of the trowel, the Vinland sagas were transformed from a legend into absolute, undeniable historical fact. The Vikings really were there.
As we wrap up this explainer, I really want to leave you with a profound question to chew on. Think about this. If the Vinland colony had survived, if those fragile supply lines had somehow held, if peace had been maintained, and the Vikings had successfully established a permanent, sprawling foothold in North America 500 years before Columbus ever set sail, how would the world map look today? It perfectly illustrates the incredibly fragile nature of history, how deeply a single, struggling settlement hanging on the very edge of the known world can alter our entire understanding of human exploration. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive. Keep asking questions.